Okay, good morning. I feel bad for the poor sucker who has to follow up Chad Fowler. Oh, wait, that's me. And what's worse is I've got James Edward Gray coming on right after me. So I'm just like wedged in between greatness, and I'm going to totally not live up to their expectations. But anyway, we're going to talk about CoffeeScript this morning because it's a Ruby conference, and you have to have at least one talk that's about a completely different language. And I'm that token talk today. So aloha. And aloha, come on. I'll say this early on. I've got books to give away, so when there's audience participation, it'll bode well for you. I will promise you one thing about this talk. Cats, there will be none of them in this talk. There'll be no cats. There'll be no animals of any kind in this talk. Thank you. This is an animal-free talk. I will show you pictures of my kids, though. But just these pictures. These are the only pictures. I'll show you pictures of my books. This is Distributed Programming with Ruby. Came out in 2009. Everybody's shown a copy of it, because I believe everybody's shown a really out-of-date tech book. I also wrote Programming in CoffeeScript, which came out this year, and it's a up-to-date tech book, so everybody's shown one of those, too. And you can get them both at books.markbates.com. And before I really start talking about CoffeeScript, I want to give you guys a very, 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 very brief history lesson about JavaScript. Meet Brandon. Brandon is a developer about 15, 16, 17 years ago, working for a little company that is doing pretty well in the browser wars. And he is tasked with writing a language to help script up what happens in the browser. So he says, OK, well, I need to do this. I'm going to write this really cool Lisp-style language. And he does just that. He writes this really great language. Meet Brandon's boss. Brandon's boss comes to him one day and says, look, Java is getting really, really popular. So we need to scrap your language. We need to make another language that's kind of Java-esque, give it a really stupid name like JavaScript so people think they're somehow related, end up becoming the bane of every developer's existence down the line. And we need it in a week. And that actually happened. So we ended up with what we know today as JavaScript. This is actually a backbone model. It's kind of a weird hybrid of Java and somebody who wrote something in a week. So you get lots of really weird things, like some typing, but not a lot of it. If you want a lot of typing, by the way, check out TypeScript. It's a way to make JavaScript even more complex. So if we fast forward about 15 years, we can meet Jeremy. Jeremy is a developer at Document Cloud, New York Times, and he is the writer of a little-known framework called Backbone. No one's ever heard of it. I know, just ignore it. This is the Backbone model we just talked about. And Jeremy's like, this is really annoying that I have to type all this sort of stuff every single time I'm working my Backbone. So Jeremy said, what if I could take this and make it look a little more like this? And CoffeeScript was born. So what is CoffeeScript? That's a great question. According to its website, it is a little language that compiles down to JavaScript. I think that's probably about the most useless sentence ever. What does that mean? Well, it does what it says, but it also easily integrates into your current JavaScript environment, and that is key. Right? A lot of people say to me, well, I like the idea of CoffeeScript, but all my other stuff is JavaScript, and I can't use CoffeeScript because I'm all JavaScript. Well, good news for you. Because it compiles down to JavaScript, you can integrate it today. You can say, I'm going to learn CoffeeScript. I'm going to write my next little part of my site in CoffeeScript. No problem. Integrates with what you have. It's kind of like JRuby, except it actually integrates with everything. Sorry, Charles. No worrying about C extensions here. It's easier to write, read, maintain, refactor. I didn't put debug in there for a very obvious reason. But we'll talk a little bit about debugging at the end. It is also a hybrid of Ruby and Python. So I imagine most people in this room are Python people, right? Everybody? Python? Awesome. Because, fuck Ruby. Oh, by the way, apparently I swear a lot in my talks. And I only realized that when I watched the last video of my talk, and I was like, oh man, I'm just dropping F-bombs all over the place. So CoffeeScript is also very helpful, and that we will talk about its helpfulness. CoffeeScript is not, however, magic. And it is limited by what JavaScript can do today. And one of those examples I like to give, especially to a Ruby crowd, is method missing. You can't do method missing in JavaScript. God knows I've tried. You can't do it. But so you can't do that in CoffeeScript. It's just impossible, right? So CoffeeScript is limited by JavaScript's limitations, but it does try to help make those limitations kind of ease off to the sides a little bit. So this is the #1 argument I get from CoffeeScript people who've never used CoffeeScript before. I'm happy writing JavaScript. I don't need to learn another language, right? And that's fine with me if that's the way you want to be. But another brief history lesson, because everybody seems to really like doing history lessons in their talks. And I'm going to butcher this next one, so you guys are going to love this. Does anybody know what this is? Assembly. Who said that? Charles. Very good. Yes, it is assembly code. Do you know what it does? Does anybody know what this assembly code does? Because I don't. I got this off a website, and the website told me what it does, and I'm really hoping it does that. No? It actually writes Fibonacci numbers. Because as Aaron said, that is what drives all business and all sales and advertising is Fibonacci number generation. And this is the way code was written for a while. I mean, there was a point in time where code was written on punch cards, too, and fed into machines. And that worked. It was fine. Why do I need to learn another language? I know assembly. I can write programs. And then someone came up with C and said, oh, I can write Fibonacci numbers much better in C than I can in assembly. And everybody's like, oh, awesome. C is awesome. And C is still in use today. And then someone came up with Java and said, I can write Fibonacci numbers better in Java. And everybody's like, awesome, and now I can write them once and run them nowhere, and life will be wonderful. And this is where I came into the picture. I started doing Java in about 98, 99, writing nothing but Fibonacci sequences for the companies I worked for, up until 2005, when I was doing what most good developers do. I was drinking with some friends. And a friend of mine said, hey, have you heard of Ruby? And in particular, it's like a little language called a little framework called Rails, and it's kind of coming out, and it's kind of cool, and you should check into it. And I was like, well, you know, I like my Java and my JSPs and my Ant build scripts and my Hibernate and my XML configuration and my struts and my Java server faces and my Java server pages and my enterprise Java beans and my IDE and yeah. Anyway, going on. Sorry, I was starting to lull myself to sleep there. And I was like, I don't need this. Why do I need Ruby? And then I saw Ruby, and here's some Fibonacci numbers in Ruby. And I was like, OK, that's pretty awesome. Now I can write Fibonacci numbers in Ruby. My life's going to be better. So there was a point in time where I was like, well, I can write an app just as well in Java as I can in Ruby. I could knock out a web app in a pretty short time and have it perform really well and do all the things that a web app needed to do. And I could do them in Ruby or Java, but damn it if Ruby did not just seem better. It was easier to write, it was cleaner, it was simpler. You could look at it and you could quickly understand what was going on. It was nicer to bring new people into the fold. They could easily find what the code was doing, and it wasn't this massive Java. And somehow I just ended my presentation. Good night. Thank you very much. I'll be here all week. Try the veal. There we go. OK, and the same goes for CoffeeScript. So of course, now I have no idea how long I've been talking for. So let's start with the #1 thing people hear most often about CoffeeScript, and that is the syntax. This is some JavaScript on the left and some CoffeeScript on the right. It's the identical code. The thing I like most about the CoffeeScript here, it's not a very complex example, but what I like most about the CoffeeScript here is my eye is drawn not to punctuation, but rather to code. I see it and I just see code. I don't see a lot of kind of cruft hanging around it. I know exactly what's happening. It's not significantly smaller than the JavaScript one in this particular example, but again, I look at it and go, okay, I can see what's going on here. I know what's happening. There are some syntax rules. So the good news for people in this talk is that we will actually look at code and we will learn something today. The bad news is we're going to look at some code and we're going to learn something today. And at the second day of a conference in the morning, after a long night, that's not always the best idea. But we're going to do our best. So there are no semicolons ever in CoffeeScript. So there is no debate in the CoffeeScript community as to should you use semicolons, should you not use semicolons. You can't. The compiler will actually kick them out and yell at you and tell you that semicolons are bad. There are no curly braces with a few exceptions, because every language has exceptions. There's no function keyword. There are a couple of the keywords we don't have. There are relaxed parentheses rules, and they're very similar to Ruby's, but again, with a few conditions. And it is whitespace significant. And that's one I get all the time. But let's look at parentheses rules first before we talk about some of the other ones. So here are some examples of the parentheses rules. When you are creating a function, as we are doing on the left, if there are no arguments for that function, you do not need parentheses. If there are arguments for that function, you do need parentheses. If you are calling a function, however, it's the exact opposite. If you're calling a function that has no arguments, you need parentheses. If you're calling a function that does not have arguments, so if you're calling a function with arguments, you don't need parentheses. So this can get you into a little bit of trouble, as we can see in this example here, where there's a lack of order of precedence. The compiler doesn't know what I'm calling text on in the first example. So it assumes that I'm calling it on the string some ID and not the jQuery object that I get back. So that results in some bad JavaScript. So you end up having to use parentheses in this case here. Even though I don't technically need them, it does preserve intent. So if you're concerned, you don't know what to do, always err on the side of parentheses. I don't think anybody's ever going to yell at you and go, oh, why did you put parentheses around that method call? It's very similar to Ruby. I personally always put parentheses in Ruby calls, exception of put s statements, because that makes sense. OK, so whitespace. I get this. This is a big argument for me. People bitch and moan. I hate having to have whitespace significant. If I wanted to be in a whitespace significant language, I'd be doing Python, not Ruby. And that's fine. And to them, I ask this question. Do you write your code like this? Or like this? Because if you do, you're kind of a douchebag. And honestly, I don't want to work with you, because this is terrible code. You can understand it, kind of. The first thing I see if I saw code like this is I would go and format it to something that looked like this, because that I can read. I can understand what's happening there. So if you're already formatting your code to be a good developer, to be a good citizen of the development community, what difference does it make if it's whitespace significant or not? It really doesn't. The big difference it makes is it actually allows the language to be cleaned up. We can turn that into this. We no longer need delimiters, because we already have a delimiter. We have whitespace. We have new lines already built in. We're already doing these things, right? This is, I know like I'm trying to sell Python up here, and it's terrible. But we already have these things, and we should be using them to our benefit. So Rubyiscript, and no, I'm not going to talk about RJS, which thankfully died a painful, painful death. I sometimes jokingly refer to it as Rubyiscript because it does look a lot like Ruby, and I have gotten my wires crossed on occasion. I'm working away, and I'm typing and typing and typing and typing, and then something blows up, and I realize I'm in CoffeeScript, and I'm putting ends everywhere, if this, the end, and and then I'm in Ruby, and I'm not putting the ends. It just becomes a big mess. But it's really fun. That's a good mess to have, I think. So here's a little example of Rubyiscript in action. We can do if statements. Again, we don't need the ands, the else statements, and we can do unless, CoffeeScript brings unless in. We can do the same line conditionals that we do in Ruby, which is really nice. Clean that up a little bit. Objects and hashes look a lot more Ruby-esque. These are 3 different ways we can create the same hash in CoffeeScript. So the first way is pretty common, looks just like a regular hash with curly braces. So here's one of the cases where you need curly braces. The second is the multi-line hash syntax, which I use constantly. And the really nice thing about this is you don't need curly braces and you don't need commas to separate your values. So you can, as you're cutting and pasting stuff into this hash that you're building, and you're moving stuff around in the hash, you don't have to worry about all these trailing commas going to bite you in the ass when you go to run it in your browser. CoffeeScript is using that indentation, using that whitespace significance to define where your hash is. And down the bottom, when we're calling the function, we can kind of do a Ruby style, passing in a hash without the curly braces. You would need curly braces if you're passing in 2 hashes, obviously. And here's the JavaScript output for that. So you can see it all generated the same thing. CoffeeScript brings string interpolation to JavaScript, which is nice, and it follows the same rules of double quotes versus single quotes that Ruby does. And there's the JavaScript, if you didn't believe me. Heredocs. CoffeeScript brings Heredocs to JavaScript, which is really, really nice. So here I'm building a big old mess of HTML, which I wouldn't recommend doing, but it's good for example purposes. And notice I'm using string interpolation in there as well. To do Heredocs in CoffeeScript, you use 3 double equals or 3 double quotes or 3 single quotes to delimit your Heredocs. And if you use a double quote Heredocs, you can do string interpolation, single quote, no interpolation. And that generates this piece of garbage, which I would hate to code by hand. Has anybody ever coded like an input tag by hand in JavaScript and forgot to escape one of the quotes? Yeah, exactly. You don't have to do that anymore. That worry's gone. Let that fade away. Functions. So here we are. Here's an example of creating a function. This function takes one argument, name, and you can call the function. And that's the JavaScript, I believe. So when I was looking at this function, the first time, when I really first started getting into CoffeeScript, I struggled with it just a little bit. It just seemed weird to me, the whole stabby arrow kind of thing. It's like, here's an argument, and I do this thing. And I don't know, I struggled with it. And then one day I had this realization. I have seen this syntax before. Not only had I seen this syntax, I had used this syntax. And I couldn't figure out where I had seen it, and I realized it's the Ruby 1.9 syntax for lambdas, just reversed. And in fact, I would argue that the syntax in CoffeeScript is actually a little nicer than the Ruby 1.9 syntax for lambdas, because you don't need the extra curly braces. So once I got that, I was like, OK, this is really a very, very, very similar language. Let's see, how am I doing for time? OK, good. Loops and comprehensions. There's loops and comprehensions in CoffeeScript. Surprise! You can do loops. Nothing all that fancy. Actually, the array one's pretty nice. You can do for some name and some array. Pretty nice. You don't have to type all the I equals 0 and the length equals some array to length, and it has to be less than or greater than the length, and you plus it, and this reminds me of Java. You can do ranges in JavaScript, in CoffeeScript, which is pretty cool, and those follow the same syntax rules as Ruby does. So in this case, I will create an array of numbers from 1 through 5, one including 5. 3 dots makes 1, 2, 5. And then I can use comprehensions to print that out. And comprehension is like a one-line for loop. So here I could say, print those numbers out to the log for every number that's in that array. And that looks like this in JavaScript. I like to show the JavaScript because I think it helps people understand these concepts a little better. And a fun little fact about the numbers there, that numbers array, I remember I created a range and it spat out this array. And so what would happen if I put 1 through 1,000? Right? You don't want to have in your code this giant block of numbers, right? So CoffeeScript, after a certain number, will actually just turn that into a for loop, and we'll print the numbers and push them into an array. The interesting part about this, and the only reason I bring it up, is one day I tried to figure out what that cutoff point was, and I did some testing. Does anybody know what number it cuts off at when it goes from printing them all out to a for loop? 42 would have been an awesome number. It is actually 22. I have no idea. I was like counting the numbers of the for loop, the letters of the for loop. I'm like, maybe it's 22 characters. No, it's not 22 characters. Makes no sense to me why it's 22. 20 would have been a better number. 42 would have been an awesome number, but it's not. You can add clauses to list comprehensions in CoffeeScript. So here, we only want to print the numbers out in this array when the numbers are less than or equal to 3. It starts getting a little hairy here, but it's kind of cool. And so that's what the JavaScript looks like when you do that. You can take the result of a for loop and store that as an array. which is incredibly helpful. So it's kind of like a MapReduce function. So here, I'm actually going to times every number by 2, as long as that number is less than or equal to 3, and I'm going to get back that into an array with the numbers 2, 4, and 6 in it. And so you can see how this starts getting a little helpful. One line of CoffeeScript, and I've created a dozen lines of JavaScript. And I can kind of very quickly look at that and know what's going on. I wouldn't necessarily use this statement, because I think that does get a little crazy after a little while. But it is nice that you can do that, and you can see how the helpfulness comes in. Classes. I mean, classes are awesome. We all love classes. We use them in Ruby all the time. And CoffeeScript lets us do them. So this is actually a valid class definition. You can define a class in one line of code in CoffeeScript, just class employee. Now I have a new employee class. I can instantiate instances of it, and I can play with it just like any other class. And that's the JavaScript for that. Right? I mean, JavaScript does not have first-class support for classes. We all know that is a prototype-based language. It does have support for creating new instances of functions, and that's all CoffeeScript is doing. It's just wrapping this kind of boilerplate code that we see on the screen to make your life a little easier. I can type one line, I get this nice boilerplate code, and now I have this great model that I can work with. Here is a little more complex example of a class. Right? I've got a constructor that gets called every time I initialize it. I have a salary function, which will return a salary, and then I could call that. And there's a few interesting parts about this class I actually want to take a moment and talk about. The first is you notice I can do default arguments in CoffeeScript, just like I can in Ruby. So here I say, OK, this class is going to take options as part of its constructor, and if no options are passed in, then set them equal to an empty hash, which is great. The other thing that's happening in this constructor is one of my favorite. I have three single character bits that happen in CoffeeScript. And this is the first single character, a little tip I'm going to give to you guys today. So this @ sign right here, @ options. When you see @ in CoffeeScript, it's essentially replacing this dot. Right? So whenever I see this, you can go, OK, if we look at the salary, I can go, if I look at the salary function, it's the equivalent of this dot options dot salary. Right? But in this constructor, I actually have the @ sign in the function call, in the actual argument list. And this is something I wish Ruby would do, because we do this every day in Ruby, and I know everybody does this, and this really should be in Ruby core. So Aaron, I hope you're listening. This needs to be in core. One of the things we do all the time in Ruby is we take a constructor, or other methods, and we might say, OK, it takes an options or an attributes array, attributes hash, and then we do this dot attributes equals, or sorry, self dot attributes equals attributes, or @ attributes equals attributes, right? We've all done it. Raise your hand if you've done that. Everybody has done that. That's happening already in that one character. So by putting an @ sign there, I am saying set whatever that argument is, set that equal to this dot options equals options. And if we actually look at the JavaScript code here, you can see that is happening in this line right here. It's a little funky because it's doing the default arguments too. But that's such a nice time saver. It just makes your code look really nice. And then we can access it with @ options later in the salary function as well. And that's what that looks like. Here we go. There's the JavaScript for that. Notice the JavaScript is getting longer with each slide as we do more interesting things. Our CoffeeScript slides are staying nice and big font, but the JavaScript slides are getting smaller and smaller. We can extend classes in CoffeeScript. So here we have the classic bad OO example of a manager extending an employee. You should not do your manager-employee relationships like this, but it's always great for demonstration purposes. And here we're going to override the salary function, and because the manager gets a nice big 10K bonus for doing whatever managers do. And we can call the super method, just like in Ruby, and get the results of the salary function from the employee class, and then mix it into our salary function in our manager class, and give them that nice bonus. And the argument rules for super that apply in Ruby also apply in CoffeeScript. So here I don't pass any arguments to super, so any arguments that get passed into salary will get passed up to super automatically. Or I could pass in my own arguments to super and override those. And then here again, the JavaScript gets smaller and smaller and tinier and tinier. Bound functions. This is the second of those single character tidbits I wanted to impart upon you tonight, or today, or this morning. I had a lot of Mai Tais last night, so I'm not even sure I'm speaking English right now. Here we get a user class, and the user takes a name, and we're going to say hi to the user. We have a function that says hi to that user and just prints it out to the log. And we have this log method down the bottom that takes a callback. And then inside that log method, it'll call that callback. Very similar to how things like jQuery work, right? Where we do something, and when the server responds, we execute some callback function. So when we do this, however, we expect it to say hello, Bob, and hello, Mary, because those are our two users. What we actually get is hello undefined for both Bob and Mary. And the reason for this is we have lost the scope of what this is. This is the part of the talk where it gets very complicated because I have to use quotes around the word this every other word. Yehuda Katz wrote a great blog post about a year ago explaining how this works in JavaScript. And I highly recommend everybody go and read it because it's a fascinating read and it's a really complex subject. So we have this problem now. We have lost this. The JavaScript engine doesn't know where we're calling that callback from. It thinks we're calling it from inside this log function, which is actually where we are calling it from. So it doesn't know. It has a new version of this that it's responding to. So how do we fix that? Well, we can fix it with the say hi call. So we have the say hi function we've defined with a single arrow. See, I've nicely highlighted it for you in yellow, which is apparently very hard to do in Keynote for some reason. So I had to fake it. Anyway, so watch that function, and I'll show you how we can get this back, the context back for our function. Ooh, fat arrow. I'll do it one more time. Single arrow, highlighted. Fat arrow. Now, if we were to run this, we'd get hello, Bob, and hello, Mary. This is a lifesaver when you're doing AJAX requests or any sort of requests that go off and do something else and are expecting callback functions later. And you want them to be able to work in the context of which they were created. So in this case, I want this callback function, when it gets executed, to work in the instance of user that it was created in. By doing this one single character, I have captured that binding and wrapped it around that method. If we look at the JavaScript, here's the same class, just without the craft of printing stuff out. You get a little bit better idea of what's happening. When it creates a new user, it actually goes and wraps that say hi function in another function and passes the original say hi function and this into it. So it now has a binding for this. It's a little weird, it's a little funky, it's definitely some JavaScript magic. The best part is you don't have to understand how it works, just that it does. And it'll save you so much time. So finally, one of my favorite features, this is the last of the three characters, the existential operator. You saw it briefly earlier, but I didn't really talk about it. If foo question mark, then log foo out to the screen. Right? With that one question mark, we have told CoffeeScript to check the existence of foo. And it's better illustrated with the JavaScript here. So if foo does not equal undefined and foo is not null, then we can log to the console. Really cleans up your code. Makes your life so much nicer. You don't have to write this stuff everywhere. But it gets better. Right? And this is the part where I always get really super excited. How many people here have left a console.log statement in their JavaScript and pushed to production? OK, a bunch of people. Now, how many people have done that on IE? Right. And if that's the point, and you only know what happened on IE, because none of us use IE, when the CEO comes running in 5 minutes later, going, the whole site has just stopped working. What happened? And it's like, oh, shit, there's no console in IE. So the JavaScript just blows up, and IE is nice. It doesn't just like raise a little error and continue. It just stops executing. We can do this. Console question mark .log. So if the console is defined, then do console.log like normal. That is brilliant. So I have my editor set up, so whenever I do console.log, it puts a little question mark in there. So if I ever forget to put it in production, if I ever push it to production, I know it'll keep running. And I know I will be safe. But it gets better. We can chain them. We can do more stuff with this. We could keep adding question mark after question mark, function call after function call. So here, if there's a current user and that current user has a first name, then do something with it. It gets a little funkier the more question marks you add, but really, really nice. So my last little interesting bit of CoffeeScript before I depart here today, The Raven. Has anybody ever read The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe? Yeah? OK, great. Has anybody ever tried to execute The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe in a compiler? No, because it is not valid anything. But that's a lie. It is actually semantically valid CoffeeScript. I have no idea who found that out, why they found that. Are they typing poems into the CoffeeScript compiler, hoping that one day they will find one that executes? And if you, oops, damn it, I did it again. Oh, nice. Now I'm getting really crazy over here. There we go. If you don't believe me, this is the JavaScript that gets compiled. So there you go. That is what the Raven would look like in CoffeeScript, should you dare ever actually try to execute it. Yeah. I just thought that was so awesome. I saw it the other day, and I was like, I've got to put that on the slide. So celebrity endorsement time. If I haven't sold you on CoffeeScript yet, I'm going to have a couple celebrities come up and actually endorse CoffeeScript. The first is Matt. Have you guys met Matt? He's around here somewhere. I don't think he's in the room, because, oh, he was going to the other talk. That's right. And we went to dinner the other night, and Matt said, I would love to give a celebrity endorsement, but I'm going to the other talk, which is not much of an endorsement. But he said, you should go to Mark's talk. He's like, you can quote me on that. You should go to Mark's talk. I was like, that's great, considering it's going to be at the very end of my talk. And then over the course of dinner, he also said, buy his book, It's Great. Not necessarily in that order, but those words eventually came out of his mouth. And I was like, you know, if they can do that with John Carter and put really nice quotes under that piece of crap, then I can probably do that with my talk, too. Corey Haines is going to come up, and he's going to endorse CoffeeScript for you. Corey's a big fan of CoffeeScript, aren't you, Corey? Let's hear it for Corey Haines, ladies and gentlemen. Corey, you can just read what's on the screen there, Corey.
I made the mistake of saying I'd read anything. When I'm not engaged in autoerotic asphyxiation, I write CoffeeScript, and you should too. The second one, not the first one.
Thank you, Corey. Corey Haines, everybody. He actually said that the other night at dinner, which is really awesome. Konstantin. Let's hear it for Konstantin Haase, everybody. Konstantin also made the pledge to read what was ever on the screen. So I apologize.
Oh, you just want me to say that?
I totally want you to say it.
Okay, I'm not negative, I'm just German. But I'm definitely positive about CoffeeScript.
Thank you, Konstantin. So, if you don't believe me, there are actual celebrities here who've been more than happy to tell you all about CoffeeScript. So, thank you, guys. What didn't I cover? I didn't cover a ton of things. I briefly talked about default arguments and ranges. I didn't talk about splatted arguments. You can do those in CoffeeScript. Scoping, security, what do I got? Strict mode, common mistakes that get generally made in JavaScript. CoffeeScript tries to fix those for you. There's a whole shitload of operators. There's a do keyword. There's so much. There's so much more. And I highly recommend you really dig into it. And I also highly recommend you read this book. So in case anybody's curious, Programming in CoffeeScript. And with that, I say mahalo for your time. I've got books. I've got 5 books to give away here. So the first 5 people with questions get to come up and pick Programming in CoffeeScript or the incredibly out-of-date, but it's still really useful, Distributed Programming with Ruby. So, questions? Yes, you, sir.
So, did you precede Google, because Google has Dart, which compiles to JavaScript?
That it does.
So they're copying you. That's very commendable.
Well, I didn't actually write CoffeeScript, but
well, I mean, the concept.
Yeah, so Dart, there's a bunch of these languages out there, as I'm sure you guys all know. Dart is one of them, and I'd highly encourage you to check out the 25,000 line hello world Dart example on GitHub, which is absolutely amazing. So you can come up and grab a book. You can grab whatever book you want here. Yes?
You said you were going to cover debugging.
Oh, I said I was going to cover debugging. Damn it, I hope no one caught that. Yeah, so debugging, there is in the works, there is support for, you have that one, there you go, good man. There is support for maps coming out soon, line maps back and forth. I personally don't have a lot of problem with debugging. You can't use a debugger, which is fine. I personally don't really use debuggers anyway. Even in my Java days, I never used them because I'm crazy and wild. So console.log statements get my goat. And when you run into an error in Chrome or Safari or whatever, you get that line number, you get the file, you know that in your user view file, in the render method, this line blew up, and it maps so close, it really becomes second nature. You're like, oh, it blew up when I was adding shit to the element through jQuery. Like, it's right there. Honestly, it's not a big deal. So that's debugging in a nutshell.
Do you think eventually we'll have in Chrome Web Developer some sort of thing that would actually just show us the CoffeeScript?
Do I think that in like Chrome Inspector or whatever, we'll actually have something that will show the CoffeeScript? I hope. That would be really awesome. But all the major browsers need to get on it. I imagine it'll get into WebKit eventually. But the source maps is going to be huge, because that really will solve a lot of this. Right? So you'll be able to click right through and right back to your editor at the exact line where it blew up, and then you're all set. So come on, grab a book. Next question. Yes, you, sir.
Talk about best practices for building opposite direction existing JavaScript.
So what, converting JavaScript to CoffeeScript?
JavaScript and what's your process for refactoring?
Right. So that's a great question. I've got a bunch of JavaScript. How do I go refactor it into CoffeeScript? What's my process? My process is I always start with CoffeeScript. But in those cases, I'll tell you a funny little story. I was with Obi Fernandez a few months ago at RailsConf, and we're out to dinner. And we're having this conversation. He's like, oh, I love CoffeeScript. It's just awesome. I really love the syntax. I think it's fantastic. I was like, great, Obi, that's really awesome. And he goes, but I still don't know how to write it. So I write all my stuff in JavaScript. This is a true story. I write all my stuff in JavaScript. I paste it into JS to Coffee. I get the CoffeeScript. I take that and paste that back into a Coffee file in my Rails app. And then I've got the CoffeeScript version of that file. So there's a site called JS to Coffee, which will convert your JavaScript to Coffee. And it does a pretty decent job. But the point of that story is he's writing it in JavaScript, converting it to CoffeeScript, and then Rails is converting it right back to JavaScript again. So I would argue just write it in JavaScript. The best way and easiest way to get started with CoffeeScript is start writing your new things in it. Instead of just kind of refactoring. And then you'll get to love CoffeeScript so much that other stuff will start getting really annoying. And then you say, okay, I'm now going to refactor this. I'm in here fixing a bug. I really hate working with JavaScript, so I'm going to take a few minutes, and I'm going to refactor it into JavaScript. It's a CoffeeScript. But check out jstocoffee.org, I think, where you can just paste in your JavaScript, and it'll spit out a bunch of CoffeeScript for you. So book if you'd like one. Any other questions? Yes, you, sir.
How do you test your CoffeeScript?
How do I test drive my CoffeeScript? That is an excellent question. I use Mocha and Chai are my preferred JavaScript testing frameworks. With Rails, there's a great gem called Konacha, K-O-N-A-C-H-A, that plugs in, lets you run command line JavaScript tests, server-based JavaScript tests. It's very RSpec-y and really nice. There's also Jasmine. Jasmine's also really good, too. I've kind of moved away from Jasmine in favor of Konacha. I like the syntax and the benefits it gives you a little bit more. If you do a Google search for me, or you go to informatit.com, there's a 2-part article series I wrote about setting up Rails to test JavaScript and CoffeeScript. And it works with the asset pipeline and everything. It's fantastic. So book if you want one. You in the corner. Zero problems integrating with jQuery. It works with every single JavaScript library on the planet. So jQuery, MooTools, Prototype, I almost said Pro Tools, Prototype, any obscure JavaScript file you have found, it will work with. So it's really nice. Come get a book. Okay, Charles, you were next, yeah?
So CoffeeScript is kind of part of Rails these days. It's built in, it's part of the asset pipeline, which works.
Have you tried using it with other frameworks like Sinatra or Padrino or any of those, and are there any gotchas there?
So it's a great question. So Rails has nice support for CoffeeScript right out of the box. What about other frameworks? Have I used it with other things? I do use it with Sinatra. It's very easy to set sprockets in the asset pipeline up with Sinatra. I'm getting to you, Konstantin. It's really nice. I've had a problem testing my CoffeeScript with Sinatra, but I'm actively working on kind of porting the Kanacha gem over to Sinatra to support Sinatra as well. So that'll be really nice. I've written a lot of just straight HTML projects and use CoffeeScript and Guard or CoffeeScript. CoffeeScript has a watcher as well to compile down to JavaScript, so then you can serve it up statically. So it's actually pretty easy to integrate, and Node has built-in support for it. So if you are writing Node apps, you can write them all in CoffeeScript really easily. So does that answer your question? Awesome. Sorry, no more books. I think the last guy took 2. Yes, Konstantin.
Yeah, I would like to add to that question, or add to the answer rather. So Sinatra supports CoffeeScript as a template language, so we can just add a CoffeeScript view and then say coffee and then the symbol for the name, and it just works, like handle or whatever. And the other thing is we use CoffeeScript at Traversier, and we now use it as a standalone, no Rails, no Sinatra, no nothing project. And what we do is we do a straight pipeline. I think it's coming from Open Social, which is like Sprocket's alternative, and it works really well.
Cool. Everybody hear that? Konstantin was saying that Rake Pipeline is a great alternative for compiling your assets that's not Rails specific, so maybe I'll check that out for my Sinatra problem that I'm having, which is great. And Sinatra also supports CoffeeScript as a templating language. So if you're responding to a JS request through Sinatra or a JSON request through Sinatra, you can create coffee views and return those, which is pretty awesome. So great. Any other questions?
Question?
Yes, over there.
Even though they don't do exactly the same thing from what I gather, can you give, so for Dart, for example, can you give another 1 or 2 competitors to CoffeeScript, and why you think CoffeeScript will win out in the short term, let's say the next 5-10 years?
Okay, so the question was, there are a bunch of competitors in very similar languages. Could I give a couple examples of them and why I think CoffeeScript is better? Is that correct? So the 2 big ones, well, the big one up to date, I would say, would be Dart. Dart has gotten very little traction and very little community, mostly because it actually requires a Dart kind of VM to run, which is why the hello world is 25,000 lines. So CoffeeScript doesn't require that because it just creates idiomatic JavaScript that can be run in any JavaScript environment. So that's a huge, huge win in CoffeeScript's favor. Microsoft just announced TypeScript last week, and TypeScript, as I mentioned earlier, adds strong typing to JavaScript because that's what we all wanted. So I guess that's an example. If you really like strong typing and you come from a Microsoft background, it's got IntelliSense support apparently, because at 50 minutes of the video, 49 minutes of him is showing off code completion, and 1 minute is talking about static typing. So yeah, I haven't actually had a chance to play with it. I probably won't play with it. I think CoffeeScript is nice. I think it, in both Dart and Java and TypeScript and things like GWT, which is the Google Web Toolkit, where you can write your JavaScript in Java, I think are actually making the problem more complicated. And they're trying to, I think they're abstracting in the wrong directions, right? They're trying to abstract to the things that people know and understand and kind of cling to in these kind of older enterprisey kind of systems, right? Where people are like, I know my Java, I don't want to leave my Java, I love my Java. So let's make my JavaScript look like Java even more. Whereas CoffeeScript is saying, hey, we can improve upon this language. We can make this a better language. And in future versions of ECMAScript, they're actually taking some of this stuff that's in CoffeeScript and making it part of ECMAScript in the future. So you can actually expect to see things like the fat arrow coming into JavaScript in a few years' time. So CoffeeScript is a great way to get your feet wet today on what the future of JavaScript development is going to be in a few years. So there you go. Other questions? Okay, yes, time for the next one. What was that? Can you repeat that question? Multiple inheritance? No. No multiple inheritance. Yeah, don't ever do multiple inheritance anyway. Corey Haines would be more than happy to yell at you for that, for thinking about it. With that said, I think I'm out of time. So a well-placed Mai Tai later will have me answer all of your questions, should you have them. So thank you guys very much. I appreciate it.